This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on escalation of Israel-Palestine conflict and its impact on geopolitics. The participants are Anil Vadhva, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing the recent escalation of violence in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We have seen in the last 6-7 days the violence has really gone up. We have the US envoy who has arrived in Tel Aviv for de-escalation talks as unrest between Israel and Palestinians continue. Ambassador Vadhva, when we see this recent escalation and violence like this has not happened since 2014, we also have the US sending an envoy there. What are the prospects for a de-escalation taking place, and what do you think has really triggered off this recent spate of violence between both the sides?
As you know, this is quite an intractable conflict between Israel and Palestine. But this immediate incident has been triggered because of the fact that it's a culmination of a host of scattered hostile events. Immediate trigger seems to be the clashes between Palestinians and the Israeli police at the Holy Hilltop compound in East Jerusalem. As you know, Palestinians were already seething with anger over the constant confrontations with the Israeli police in East Jerusalem over restrictions at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the mosque is considered to be the third holiest site in Islam, and the postponement of a court ruling to decide the fate of evicted families in Sheikh Jarrah, which is also a predominantly Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, only added fuel to the fire. To top it all, there was a show of strength by Israeli Jews on the 10th of May when they took out a procession to mark Jerusalem Day, which celebrates the capture of East Jerusalem in 1967. During the holy month of Ramadan, Hamas, which is the militant group which has occupied Gaza, has always demanded that Israel call back its police deployment from the Temple Mount, which, as we know, is a site revered by both Muslims and Jews, and also the Sheikh Jarrah district. Now, Palestinian families in this area frequently have faced eviction at the hands of Jewish settlers. However, the latest ultimatum was unheeded when the extremists took over and they reportedly started launching rockets from Gaza into Israel. So by the beginning of this week, we saw some stun grenades, tear gas, and rubber bullets, Holy Hilltop compound. So that was quite a clash which happened over there. And we've seen that civilians and security forces have sustained injuries alike. Deaths have been reported from both sides, with innocent children falling victim to internecine power struggles. So that's how it all started as far as this particular conflict is concerned. You also asked about the aspect in future, and you mentioned about the US envoy landing in the region and trying to diffuse tensions. We also have the force of international public opinion behind a settlement of this conflict. UN Security Council is meeting, and they will, under the presidency of China, try and diffuse the situation as well. But we've seen so far that the UN Security Council has failed to come up with anything except platitudes. And that's because even though the UNSC is united 14 votes to 1 in terms of a settlement and coming out with a statement, we have a U.S. opposition and a veto on going forward with that statement. So I think the role of U.S. intermediary would be very important, more so because of the fact that, as far as the Palestinian Authority is concerned, President Biden has spoken to President Mahmoud Abbas only yesterday. And of course, the Israeli leadership has been in touch with the United States and President Biden as well.
Master Vadhva, as you mentioned, we have the US President Joe Biden. He made diplomatic phone calls to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas yesterday. And the international community has been urging both sides to end the escalation. But there is also a feeling that for President Biden, the Middle East and the Israel-Palestine conflict is not so much as a priority as it was, say, for President Trump. Biden would rather focus on something like, say, China. Do you feel that this conflict is going to force the US to re-engage with both the Israelis and the Palestinians in a more engaged fashion, which we didn't really see coming from the Biden administration so far? They haven't even announced a nominee as ambassador to Israel so far.
The Biden administration has not been very forthcoming in terms of the promises that it had made earlier. It had promised a lot by way of re-engaging the region. We had a different kind of engagement as far as President Trump is concerned with the region, where we saw that the Palestinians were quite taken aback when the Abraham Accords happened under President Trump, where we saw an agreement being reached between UAE and Israel, Bahrain and Israel, and also Morocco and Israel. Now that sort of shifted the balance in favor of those who did not want to pursue conflict. But as you know, the Palestinian leadership is also divided. President Mahmoud Abbas belongs to the Fatah, and which is the West Bank, and then there is the militant Hamas, which has been dominant in the Gaza Strip, where the conflict is currently happening. So as far as President Abbas is concerned, I'm sure the Israelis would be more comfortable dealing with him, provided that he does not come together as a package with Hamas, because Israel regards Hamas as a terrorist organization. So does the United States, and so do the Europeans. So we have a divided Palestinian leadership. And in that situation, the U.S. administration would certainly like also to make sure that they deal with President Mahmoud Abbas to defuse the situation. How they're going to do that by taking out Hamas of the equation is a million-dollar question, because it is Hamas which is actually a militant force and is the dominant force which is actually engaged in conflict with Israel.
Master Vadba, as you pointed out the role of Hamas and how this makes for a very difficult situation, because one, you have the Palestinian leadership to deal with, but the question is also of Hamas. And a lot of analysts have pointed out that for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he has also said that the real threat to his country comes from Iran and not from what seems to be a dormant conflict with the Palestinians. He has said that Israel could exist with a no-cost occupation while establishing relations, as you said, with Bahrain and the UAE, but the problem would be Iran. Do you feel that we have a new US administration, a relatively new one? We saw Trump taking a distance from Iran. Do you feel that an engagement with Iran is very important if one has to find a solution to what we see in the Israel-Palestinian conflict today?
Engagement with Iran in these circumstances would be helpful in reaching some sort of an agreement as far as the Israeli-Palestinian issue is concerned. However, that is going to take some time, because Hamas has support from Iran, it has support from Turkey as well as from Qatar. And in the current circumstances, the Hamas leadership has been meeting in Lebanon with the Hezbollah leadership as well for support. Obviously, the weaponry that has come about in the Gaza Strip could not have come there without the support of outside powers. And those who can supply this weaponry and rockets could only be countries which are supportive of Hamas. So we have a clear indication as to where that could have come from. To diffuse that situation, of course, we will have to have circumstances created in which Iran, for instance, refuses to back the Hezbollah in Lebanon. It also drops its support for Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and there is pressure put from all sides on Hamas to cease hostilities. But we have a difficult situation as far as the Israeli-Palestinian situation itself is concerned, because on the one hand, we have Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who's going into the fifth round of elections, and he would like to emerge as a strong leader with projection that he will be the best defender of Israel. And the current situation in Israel is that there is a opposition which is trying to unite against Netanyahu and to form an alternate government with the support of an Arab party. And so in this situation, there is more at stake for Prime Minister Netanyahu to come down on Hamas with a heavy hand. The second issue is the fallout between Mahmoud Abbas, Fatah, and Hamas, which has happened since 2006-2007. And in the current situation, it is very difficult for them to come together despite the common threat that they face. Mahmoud Abbas is now 84 years old. He is not seen to be someone who can stand up forcefully against Israel. And in this situation, the Hamas leadership finds itself with an opportunity to prove itself by taking an aggressive stand.
Ambassador Wadhwa, how do you see the role of the other Arab states in it? We have the United Arab Emirates and we have Bahrain who have signed accords with Israel. We have Saudi Arabia, which seems okay as far as Israel is concerned. The relationship which is tense is basically Iran and Israel and Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region. But apart from Iran, how do you see the role of the other states as far as this conflict is concerned? Do you feel that a state like, say, Saudi Arabia or UAE, do they have a role that they can potentially play in a positive fashion?
We have a meeting of the OIC which is also taking place, and there Saudi Arabia has come out with a very strong statement as usual in favor of Palestine, because the Arab sentiment obviously will now unite in favor of Palestine, even though it is a divided leadership. Earlier aim of the US administration behind the Abraham Accords was that they could convince Israel to work with the United Arab Emirates and perhaps later with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia if they come to support the reconciliation like UAE has done, to pump in some finances into the Palestinian territories like West Bank and Gaza, and to change the situation on the ground where the leadership of Hamas, for instance, would not find favor with the local population for pursuing a militant agenda, because Palestinians would find themselves in a better situation with finances which are coming in from these countries and see development around them, which would allow them to come to terms with living side by side with an Israeli administration, even though there are pockets of Palestine which have been carved out in the West Bank. So that in the current circumstances seems to be off the rails, and unless this conflict is stopped, I don't think the US administration and the other countries in the region who signed the Abraham Accords can proceed with that plan.
Ambassador Wadhwa, India shares a very good relationship with Israel. India also shares a very good relationship with the Palestinian Authority. So how does India manage this balancing act where we have two actors with whom it shares an excellent relationship and they are in a conflict? So how is India going to balance this out between two friends?
So currently India is in the UN Security Council, and it has been seriously concerned at the growing violence and crashes in Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount, and also the evictions from Sheikh Jarrah and Silvan neighborhoods. So our representative in the UN has already made a statement asking both sides to avoid changing the status quo. And India, of course, has also mourned the death of Indian national in Israel while condemning the violence, especially rockets attack from Gaza. So India has called for an immediate de-escalation. Once again, you see that polemics are on display, but the resolve of Hamas and Israel see no sign of petering out. India can be a part of the UN Security Council joint statement, or it can help shape the joint statement, or at least it can bring about a common meeting of minds for that joint statement in the UN Security Council. But on the ground, let's face it, the main players are the United States and Hamas and Israel.
Ambassador Wadhwa, for a very long time when we discussed the Israel-Palestine conflict, there was also this theory that maybe a two-state solution would be the best way forward.
So the two-state solution is still on the table, but now Israel has changed the situation on the ground by carving out settlements from the Palestinian territory in West Bank. And if you see today, there are islands, 367 odd islands of Palestinian territories which are there in West Bank. Of course, the Gaza Strip remains predominantly Palestinian, but the latest plan from the Trump administration had further changed that status quo, and it proposed that, his Palestinian territory could still be further carved out, and Israeli state could gain some parts of land in Gaza as well. Now, the reason behind all this is that the Israelis do not want to provide independent air access or independent sea access to the Palestinians. And so Palestine in that situation would be dependent on Israel for its contacts with the outside world. And this is not acceptable to the Palestinians. And that is the crux of the matter. The current situation and the current proposal on the table, which was actually tried to be brokered by the Trump administration, is not acceptable to the Palestinian leadership, whereas the opposite will not be acceptable to the Israeli leadership.
With this, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on escalation of Israel-Palestine conflict and its impact on geopolitics. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our website newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.